Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the topic, but most importantly, I like to make it something fun and interesting to learn. And in today's episode, it's actually something rather simple that I want to discuss, and that's the difference between solvency and liquidity. And so on the one hand, it's fairly easy to look these up in the dictionary. And so for example, your liquidity, it's money, it's resources that you have access to today that you can get to pay a bill that's due today. So if a bill is due today and currently you have absolutely no way to pay that bill except, let's say, to borrow money, however you can only borrow the money tomorrow, then you're illiquid because you're unable to pay the bill that's due today. Your solvency, on the other hand, is your total access to resources. Whatever bargaining skills you have, whatever other skills, whatever other experiences led to this point, these will help determine your solvency in the long run. And so you can see from these very simple definitions that your liquidity matters more than your solvency. If a bill comes due today and you have absolutely no way of paying it, however you defer the bill until tomorrow, then you're solvent. And what you've essentially done is turn a liquidity issue into a solvency issue, because that then means tomorrow you're going to have to come up with the resources to pay that bill. If a bill is due in 20 days and it's more than the total access to resources that you have today, you might be insolvent. And so you can't be illiquid and solvent because you'll simply go out of business. However, you can of course be the opposite. You can be liquid but insolvent, simply because as you go day by day, even if the total access to resources that you can get today is not enough to pay a bill that's due in 30 days, for example, if enough days pass and enough things change, you might be able to get access to those resources and pay that bill that's due in 30 days. And this of course begs the question, why do we care? Why does it matter? Well, it matters ultimately to how the economy, as a general rule, is run. It is of course the case that liquidity is a man-made restriction. It's not a scientific or a natural law that when a bill comes due and you don't pay it that you immediately go out of business. That's simply decided by other people. You can imagine that from your own perspective as an individual. You have a bill, let's say from your power company, and it's due today, and you have no access to money, you simply can't pay it, then it's very easy to imagine from that point you're then forced to come up with a way to pay that money. You're forced to either borrow money, sell something, or draw upon your savings. There's something you have to do to pay that bill that's due today. And ultimately that's because you're powerless against the power company. However, we can imagine that if these rules, these arbitrary rules that we set up, were relaxed, then people and businesses wouldn't have to pay their bills on a specific date. Then you wouldn't run into a liquidity issue, you'd simply run into solvency issues. Now, of course, one of the big reasons the economy as a whole isn't run like this, why every single business and every single person in the economy is blasé about when they're paid, is because investment in such a scenario is much harder to do, it's much harder to plan out. Let's say a business owner is expanding his shop, his physical space. It's all well and good for the business owner in this instance to be able to choose when to pay out to, let's say, the tradesmen and to the people who are going to come and actually do the work to expand his shop. However, the business owner is involved on both sides of the transaction. That means those people can also choose when and how they will turn up to do the job. And so from this very simple example, it makes sense that we want to lock people into very specific times, including when we pay them and when we also get paid. And if a single business does this, where it demands that people turn up at a specific time, and the business then demands that it gets paid at a specific time, then the other side of that is that the business itself has to pay out its own bills at a specific time. This then has a domino effect because those builders and those tradesmen, they then impose the same demands down the chain. And eventually this filters around to the entire economy. And of course, this does pose problems for people. You have to pay bills when they're due, and you can be perfectly solvent. Your future could be looking bright. However, if a bill comes in and you can't pay it, then you're illiquid and you're in trouble. However, of course, in the long run, this is for the best. Even if a few people or a few businesses go out of business, then more people will replace them. And more specifically, those newcomers, they know the game. They know that they have to pay their bills on time. They know that they have to remain liquid. And the point here is that your liquidity and your solvency can ultimately come down to your personal attributes and to your history. If as a business owner you've been borrowing money, but you've been very lax or you've been very poor at paying back that money, if a bill is due and you have to borrow money today to pay it, then your options might be limited and you might become illiquid simply by virtue of your actions and who you are as a person. On a personal note, I used to work in a computer shop, and my boss was very good at coming up with money exactly when it was due. And there were many potential crises where bills were due and it was very hard done by cash at the time. However, every single time he was able to make calls, he was able to call in favors, he was able to get in last minute loans and so on. But his ability to remain liquid, even if he wasn't necessarily solvent at all times, was due to his personal characteristics. It was mostly due to who he was as a person. His experience and everything that made him up, everything that led to that point, that led to him being liquid in that moment. And this is ultimately what we care about. If you imagine that proverbial $1 million mansion, or the $1 million right now, especially in Canberra, only gets you a really big house. But anyway, if you imagine that glittering, shining, proverbial $1 million mansion, and we give it, let's say, to a spoiled brat, to someone that we can all agree does not deserve that mansion. And let's say for the sake of this example, that mansion is all they own. They have no other income, they have no job, and they have no savings. Let's say a bill comes due that person, that spoiled brat, then has to pay. How are they going to pay it? Are they going to sell off part of the mansion to pay that bill? Of course not. All they have is that mansion. They are solvent. If a $1 million bill comes in, they can sell that house and they can pay that $1 million bill. However, they are illiquid. And the point here is that bills will arrive. They are using resources and eventually they're going to have to pay for them. Now you might say to yourself, okay, the person will just rent out a room in his mansion. Fair enough, but that is providing value to someone else. And that is something that must be planned for in the future. That is not something you can do on the day that the bill is due. And you might also say, oh, okay, it's not realistic for the person to not have a job. Of course they're going to have a job and they're going to have some savings to then be able to pay that bill. But the thing is, once again, that means they're providing some sort of value to society. They can't just sit back and enjoy that mansion on its own. They must, at some level, be providing some sort of value to society and obviously getting paid for it. And then they can pay the bills that come due and they can remain liquid. And so there's less chance of resources going to waste. That mansion will not remain unused and that person will be contributing to society. And so ultimately liquidity forces us into actions. And especially if you're a small business owner or if you have large bills coming due, they force action upon you and they will test you and they will force you to take some sort of action to then be able to pay that bill. And in the course of taking that action, or indeed preparing to take that action in the future, you're providing value. Now, of course, not all actions that you take provide value, but in the aggregate, all of our actions, especially because we're compelled to take them, we end up providing value to society. Now, of course, this is not to say that all bills are fair, or that every single bill that's sent out is efficient for society. There are indeed some businesses which send out bills that have to be paid. However, on the whole, those businesses might be worthless. And indeed, they might be a net drain upon society. It would be better and more efficient from a macro perspective if some of those businesses didn't exist. However, in the aggregate and on the whole, the bills that businesses send out, they represent activity and they represent good activity for all of us. And when those bills come due, we have to take action and we have to anticipate those bills coming up, or if they're unanticipated, we have to take action now. But ultimately, in the aggregate, those actions that we take, they help other people and they help the economy in the aggregate. Simply because in the moment, we are forced to be innovative, we're forced to think, we're forced to use our faculties. And ultimately, everything that makes us up, everything that got us to that point will, for the most part, of course, help us get through that moment, help us pay that bill and help us to fight another day. But it's all of these small actions which we're forced to take because of liquidity concerns, which help create the aggregate economy and ultimately pushes us forward into the future where hopefully we're going to be richer. But innovations and new ways of thinking, these things are forced upon us by liquidity concerns. And it's these actions that we take which will hopefully form a better tomorrow for all of us. So I hope that was helpful and hopefully that went beyond the simple dictionary definition of liquidity and solvency, and ultimately helped you understand the macroeconomy a little bit better. So that's all I want to say on this topic for now. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, rate, and share. All the good stuff. It definitely helps my channel. And I'll see you guys next time.